Hi, everyone. Welcome to the JupyterLab Notebook developer meeting for Thursday, November 18th. And today we have Sam Penrose from Mozilla joining us. And welcome, Sam. And hello to everyone on the internet. So I'm listed first on the HackPad agenda, but I'm going to move myself down to the bottom so I have some time to type some notes. And Matthias is here. It says that he's got a bad internet, so he's going to stay audio only and listen. So I guess Steve, you're the first person there on the HackPad.
Been trying to aggressively attack the beta issues milestone on JupyterLab. I think I've closed quite a few this week, so good progress. Been working closely with the RBrains folks on the abstract editor. We had some in-person discussion, Jason, Ian, and myself last week, and then Alex and Anton from RBrain are helping move that work forward. So I think we're getting close to a good solution that works for everybody. And also been working with Darian this week on the state saving refresh database that he can talk about further.
Okay, I guess I'll go. Yeah, so like Steve said, there's a new concept top-level plugin in JupyterLab called StateDB, and it's both an interface and an implementation. The interface is for just a generic database that takes just a generic key value store, and it can be pulled for the max length of what it's going to store. The idea is that you can give it any JSON value, it serializes it and stores it. So the max length actually is the length of the string, which can be confusing because JavaScript strings aren't predictable in the size they might actually be when they get stored. And there might be some confusion, but chances are pretty good it won't come up because we're not going to store massive things. The current implementation, as its backend, it just uses local storage, but of course you could imagine server-based or whatever else. And so all of the calls to it return promises in case we need to do an async version. And right now, because we don't have a way of restoring layout yet, all we're doing is we're just restoring the existence of components that were there before you hit refresh. So I might have had 4 notebooks open, and they might each have had their own separate mini window in the dock panel. When I refresh the page, I'll get 4 tabs in the main dock panel with all 4 notebooks. So I will have lost the layout, but I will have retained the notebook. Right now, it supports just notebooks, consoles, and terminals, but I have an open PR to do editors and to do CSV widgets. And I'm just working through some of the things that can go wrong. So if you restart your server, then it'll try to recreate a console with a session that no longer exists, so I need it to fail gracefully. If you delete a file, you delete a CSV, for example, I'm trying to figure out what's a good way for it to try to load and then fail gracefully. But basically, the minimum experience of refreshing the page and not losing your stuff might require layout to be retained as well, but at least we're one step closer now. Yeah, so that's it.
So let's see. So question about that DB. This is going to be server side, right?
No, it doesn't have to be. The idea, it depends on what sorts of things we want to store where. So for example, we might introduce a settings plugin that for the first implementation uses this and just sits in your browser local storage, and then we upgrade it to use the backend. But we might never want the backend to hold your session state when you refresh the page. So we might pick some things that belong server side and some things that belong client side. This particular thing is probably going to always make more sense to have at least some things, some portions of it be server side, but some be client. It might even be the case that we come up with like a flag that you send in when you say save, like save local or save server side, or it might be the case that we come up with a separate plugin that's persistent StateDB versus like non-persistent StateDB. I'm not sure yet. But currently it's just using your browser local storage. And really the use case we have in mind is you just hit refresh and we don't want you to be annoyed anymore.
Right. Okay. So it's both. So a lot of it sounds like it's the identifying the interface that we can start to code against and then handle the implementation choice sort of as we go along. And I suppose you could even imagine having multiple instances of this in a given JupyterLab where some are browser local star and another might be server based.
Yeah, so right now it's meant to be used as a plugin with one static instance, but we can imagine another plugin that actually adheres to the same exact interface, and it is also a static instance, but it's an instance that talks to a server-based backend. So the main idea is to get that interface right and to get everyone using an abstraction over whatever storage we're actually gonna put into the implementation.
Great. I think that sounds like a fantastic approach.
Cool.
Okay. Anything else from your side, Darren?
No, that's it for me.
Okay. I guess I'm the next person on the hackpad. So I've mostly been working on some design-related things. Cameron's been doing a lot of sort of homework and investigation on font icons and or icon fonts, and also SVG-based icons. And there's a very nice blog post that actually let me post on the hackpad so folks can read it. Recently, in 2016, earlier in February, GitHub transitioned over to delivering all of their icons using SVG. And they have a fantastic blog post about that. And it is now in the hackpad. The hackpad is behaving oddly. There we go. And so Cameron has started a pull request trying that out. One thing that immediately showed up is that the development and design workflow becomes 1,000 times easier in that any of our designers can then just open SVG files and edit them, and those are stored in the repo and used as is. And so, and there's no, it looks like there's no rendering artifacts with SVG-based icons. They don't have any of those problems that traditional icon fonts have. And so Cameron's putting together a pull request to basically try that out. Our big question right now is how the performance will be. My guess is that it will be fine in that GitHub right now has likely many more icons on their typical page than we will have, and I don't think that's been an issue for any of us. I've never heard people complaining about the performance issues on GitHub. But Cameron will submit a pull request and look at that. And then also, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, some of the SVGs we have are embedding PNGs inside. They're base64 encoded PNGs inside the SVG. So I have that, and I said that SVG is great. Just make sure you have full SVG all the way down, so we're actually doing it right. But yeah, no, I think this approach sounds great. Otherwise,
yeah, no, we can definitely work with Cameron to make sure that we've got sort of pure and simple SVGs that load quickly. It's likely that, I mean, what he's trying right now, just to make it simple, is just copying over the needed icons from material design, but not the whole material design repo. That's huge. Just the icons we need, and just in the SVG format. This is just a test. If we turn out to like this approach, either we can use those material design icons, or Cameron and the other designers can design a custom icon set, or a mixture. I mean, obviously, material design and Font Awesome don't have an icon to denote a Jupyter notebook, and that's something we likely want to have. And also, I think Cameron wants to start to come up with sort of general principles for icon design in JupyterLab, in that a lot of other people who are starting to write plugins are going to end up having icons as well. And it would be nice to be able to tell them, here are the aspect ratios of the icons you should design for. Here's the padding around the icon you should design for. Font sizes or icon sizes, things like that. But we'll keep everyone posted. He was making good progress on that. The other is I have been doing some work, sort of trying to assess how we get from where we are today to the beta and the 1.0 release from a interaction and visual design perspective. And so I've been spending time studying this. I think some initial thoughts. One is that one thing we found when we released the original notebook is that the time between us being feature complete in the original notebook and the time us releasing, because of sort of design refinements, and mostly not visual design, but a lot of just interaction design, UX, was quite long. And I just want to flag for everyone that we need to allow some amount of time from being sort of feature complete to being release ready. And the beta can be part of that. I don't think we need to have all of our interaction and UX design problems solved by the beta, but I think that will be one step along the way. One thing I'm trying to think about, how can we start to think more about that? And my initial recommendation, and I don't know if other folks are willing to play this game, is for all of us to start to spend one day a week doing all of our development using JupyterLab. So don't open the regular terminal and TextMate and Sublime Text and Atom or whatever text editors, but literally just only open JupyterLab and develop JupyterLab in JupyterLab and develop the other software. I think that's one way that we're all going to discover the pain points very quickly and become sort of, we want ourselves to become frustrated with the design before our users do. And I think, so I don't know if people are willing to do that. I'm trying to do that. And so over the weekend, I did basically just worked in JupyterLab. I'd love to, before I talk more, I'd love to hear comments on that idea.
Having the state refresh definitely helps that.
Yeah, that does help that. I just laughed out loud with the mute on, so I figured I should. I mean, so it sounds like a really good way to intimately become familiar with things that might bug people, but it's also the case that the kind of development that goes into building the application is really different than the development that goes into creating notebooks. So we're not really building the tool for this job, but it's similar enough that it's probably worth spending some time, at least a few times, to see what it feels like. But writing TypeScript is very different than creating a notebook.
It is, and I think the main parts that we'd be able to test this way would be sort of the overall application shell, the menus, the command palette, the file browser, and the terminal and text editor. Obviously, we're not writing notebooks when we develop JupyterLab. We're writing in TypeScript, and writing TypeScript without all the extra help we get from an environment like Visual Studio Code would be horribly painful. And so, it may be the type of thing that if you're writing markdown files for documentation, or you're working on the setup.py script or the package JSON, or, just try to use JupyterLab as it's feasible. And I know, and also, it may be true that today we're not quite ready to do that, like having the session state restore would really improve that. And so, but I at least wanted to bring it up as like something that we might think about doing increasingly more often as we get closer to the beta and release.
Yeah, that's a good idea. And there's definitely, it's a heterogeneous set of files that we work on, and some of them are substantially easier to do outside of an IDE than others. So yeah, for sure.
Yep. The other, so I've been reading a book by Alan Cooper called "The Inmates Are Running the Asylum," and it's a pretty brutal book if you're a programmer. it really it comes close to blaming the world's problems on programmers. Not quite. It's dialed back a little bit from that. And for those of you who don't know, so Alan Cooper is a designer who's really been behind a lot of sort of changes in design thinking over the last 2 decades. And he's the one that invented the idea of personas. And actually, it was this book that he sort of first introduced that idea. And it's been really challenging, honestly, to read it. Part of it is that while the topic of the book is not in any way diversity and outreach, his evaluation of sort of the programming world and sort of how products get and software gets built by programmers, and what happens sort of in how that interacts with the design process. It's like, honestly, a lot of the things he ends up talking about, you could imagine, oh my gosh, yeah, this culture would be incredibly toxic and difficult for non-programmers, but also for minorities, underrepresented groups. And a lot of the things that are in that book, I hear a lot from the non-programmers in our project, the designers, Anna, and others, some of the business students we've had, and so I don't know, it's, again, I identify myself as a programmer. I don't get to program as much as a lot of you, but it's a really challenging book. I don't know if folks are interested in looking at it, but it's really, really thoughtful about sort of how we build software and how that interacts with design. So I figured I'd at least bring it up. Cameron is back from Microsoft and working quite a bit. And so if folks have design work related to JupyterLab, please loop him in. He's available. He's definitely can help out. And I'm also having him start to manage work with our other designers, with Therica and Sporthy as well. And so we have a good amount of design cycles if folks need that. And looks like Sam, you're next.
So my interests actually dovetail quite closely with what you've been speaking about over the last few minutes, Brian, which is that we're in a similar situation where I support a whole bunch of statistics PhDs who are trying, interestingly enough, to understand the use of a complex interface, namely Firefox. And so we have large amounts of data. So we throw it on S3 and we hyper competent data engineers picked Spark as our distributed data framework. So the PhDs got to use Spark. And that comes along with Jupyter Notebooks as the preferred interface. And immediately they were all covered in blood from paper cuts. And they've sort of slowly climbed the learning curve. And I really speak that not as an indictment of Jupyter Notebooks, which are this wonderful tool that have grown up over time. If anything, the Spark project, which I know is very closely tied to UC Berkeley and all that, needed an IDE, and here was a very good IDE, so they put it on. But there are the IDE was not designed for, or the UX was not designed for these folks, and it's no indictment of the UX that it doesn't fit their needs, but I'm trying to figure out how to navigate that. And to your point about programmers and UX, and I think even more interestingly in your lead-in where you were asking your colleagues on the project to do what is so inartfully called dogfooding it, I'm trying to figure out how to break through that loop. And the method I've chosen is to analyze how people are using the IDE to get information. So it's not about when I look at it and I use it what I think is a good idea. It's imperfect. Ironically, that's actually the work that we are all doing on Firefox. So the reason I have a job is that I'm trying to do that for Firefox. Right. So this is all very long-winded. I thank you for your indulgence. But one option you have is to instrument JupyterLab in beta form, and you would have to, there needs to be a process where you let users know, hey, we would like to collect this information. And there are simple things you can do, like you can say they created this kind of cell, this kind of cell, this kind of cell, but not include any of the data inside the cells, right? Yep. So it can be anonymized in that way. There are issues with fingerprinting. You can make that as complicated as you want to, but I think there are simple practical things you can do, certainly if it's your colleagues sending their information only to a private database that only you have access to, for example, right? But that can get you around the issue of, well, I tried to use it for this task that it didn't quite fit so that I could learn what the problems were, but it was not really the right task. You see where I'm going with this. And instead you can just say they opened these two panels and immediately they got a trace back, and then we lost connection with the server, right? And that can all be bundled up into a JSON blob and sent someplace that can be later analyzed programmatically. So thank you for listening to me talk about all this. Matthias has been very helpful on the HackerPad about helping me. I am looking for repositories, preferably large, of notebooks which are used by people working with distributed data. So not finished work to present and not like, hey, here's how to go do this, but here are 20 people working on Dask at UC Berkeley or something else somewhere else, and here's all their work in progress stuff. The messier and more realistic, the better. And then we're going to release a small tool that folks can use internally on their own repositories that they point at, and plug in arbitrary functions that go notebook by notebook and cell by cell to say, there were this many cells with tracebacks. Here was the ratio of Markdown to R to Python cells. Here are all the notebooks that created a graph. Here are all the notebooks that read data, began by reading data from S3, then put it into a distributed processing framework, and then did X with it. And my goal is to generate actually a notebook with some of this information so that we can start to speak based on data, and also hopefully empowering some other folks who aren't necessarily notebook hackers themselves, but they can take an example notebook pointed to their own repo and say, hey, you know what? you think that the important thing is this, but I've got this repository of 600 notebooks that says, actually, we need to solve this other problem.
Yeah.
So if anybody has suggestions for targets, and again, it's preferably working repos, not tutorials, and not like, hey, here's my magnificent finished project.
So yeah, I'm sure Matthias is providing really good ideas.
Yeah, I can't keep up with them. Thank you, Matthias, but I promise to go back and read them and track them down.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I'm wondering about is in January, I'm teaching a data science course for undergraduates at Cal Poly, and a lot of their homework wouldn't work for this, in the sense it's very, I give them a notebook and they just fill in the cells that are sort of the answers to the problems. But towards the end of the quarter, I do give them a larger project, and that is much more free-form. They're starting from blank notebooks, working all the way up to, over the course of a couple of weeks, final presentation-ready notebooks. But they obviously go through the whole process there. And it may, I mean, I'd have to think about sort of having them turn in notebooks, or intermediate notebooks, or just asking them to run a tool on their intermediate notebooks, or like that may, and where I think that user group would be nice is that I think you'd get a really accurate perspective on the full, like, how do you start a large data science project from picking a data set, exploring the data set, cleaning the data, like it's going to go through the whole thing. And you also have more than n equals 1 statistic on this. You'd get, I don't know what our final student number, but maybe around 50 students all going through the same process at the same time. So I'm more than willing to talk to you more about that.
That sounds great, honestly. I mean, I think one of the dynamics I want to tackle is that you can only contribute if you're an expert, but a lot of the pain is felt by people who aren't experts, and how do you break through that divide? So that sounds like a perfect way to tackle that one.
Yeah. So we have a bit more background on instrumenting and user testing. So we have done some qualitative user testing. I've got a set of students at Cal Poly who are designers and also CS programmers, and we had them do user tests at the SciPy conference this past summer on JupyterLab. And we're likely going to do more of that, but we have thought about doing more quantitative instrumentation-based user testing. In JupyterLab, I don't think it would be difficult to write a plugin on the front end that does that sort of instrumentation. The easiest way, at least at a very coarse-grained level, would be to write a plugin that records events that happen in the command manager. So I don't know how familiar you are, Sam, with the architecture of JupyterLab, but a lot of the top-level actions run through the command system. And so, if we simply put a hook in there that every time a command is called, we record that event, we would have minimally the broad workflow of everything that covers sort of what files are users opening, what are they doing with those files, and I think that would be an initial point. And there's been a lot of discussion about how to deploy instrumentation in an open source project, and in particular Jupyter. And there's sort of two answers. One is deploying it for all our users does bring up a lot of really more challenging privacy questions. Now, obviously, Mozilla has navigated these things, and it might be very helpful for us to have conversations about that. The easy thing that we can do is that a number of us have fairly decent sized deployments of Jupyter, where we could just unilaterally decide on that deployment, we're going to instrument it. And like at my university, we are deploying it campus-wide as a resource, research resource for faculty and staff, and then also within individual classes. And so we could easily run instrumentation over the period of a quarter or 6 months and gather sort of detailed instrumentation data.
In general, it's much easier. There are many fewer thorny issues with large aggregates than there are with individual transmissions. So if you have a deal where you're only individually transmitting within a legal and sort of secure entity, and then what it publishes is aggregations, that's a very simple way to avoid a lot of the challenges.
Yeah. And actually, so we have, I've talked extensively with our university's human subject research board, and it's quite interesting. As long as the data that's, have we lost everyone else? Darian, okay. Darian Matthias is still there. Looks like Steve is gone.
I'm still here.
Okay. As long as the data that we gather is only used to improve the software, it's not subject to human subject review. And it's odd. So if we were to gather the data and publish a paper about it, that does trigger human subject review, at least at our university. I mean, other companies are not subject to the same review processes universities are. But like, for example, for me to instrument our campus-wide Jupyter Hub deployment or our Jupyter Hub deployment for a data science class, like, yes, I have to be careful, and I'm not going to collect data that has privacy problems. But the university doesn't require any formal review of that data. I'm wondering, Sam, can you speak to sort of what fraction of the paper cuts are due to sort of Jupyter in general versus sort of the integration between Jupyter and Spark?
The latter is my emphasis. And so one of my primary motivations for engaging with the community this way is Spark is not the only distributed computing platform out there. And so I want to get at least very simple information on what is idiosyncratic to one distributed computing library and what is common to the nature of distributed computation. So I'll give you a simple example. Has a notebook lost contact with at any link along the chain between the notebook to the HTTP server to, in the case of PySpark, you connect with a Python interpreter, which then is connecting to a Java VM, which then is distributing out a thing. So there's many chains along the way, and things can break at each point. And beginning analysts waste enormous amount of time waiting for a job that is never going to return because of that. Another simple one is some operations in the notebook trigger large distributed computations, others don't. So being able to have the interpreter have a common language for saying this is a distributed operation, this is not. Then there are workflow issues. So a lot of our workflow is gather distributed data, bring it into a cluster, do stuff with it, and then either pull it onto the local machine or push it someplace else. And I did not know about JupyterLab when I started on this project, which I thought was going to be a simple, small thing that nobody else was going to be interested in. But I'm excited about JupyterLab because there's some inherent ways in which the architecture of that is going to make us writing our workflow much, much more straightforward. Whereas in the notebook, it's kind of like, how do we rip this thing apart? And yeah, so there's a range of issues. Another one is like, can we just have something more like our studio where there's one panel that shows you which objects currently exist in your workspace, and in turn, we can then decorate them to indicate this is a handle to a distributed object, this is just a local variable. That kind of thing is huge if you are unfamiliar with the problem space. If you are the people on this call, that's trivial, right? So that's another one of those things where I want to design for people who are new, not for people who are very good at constructing on-the-fly mental models of distributed computation workspaces.
Yeah, that I should note that particular feature, like a variable inspector, is one of our longest and most common feature requests. And I know of someone who's already implemented a plugin for that in JupyterLab.
Awesome.
It's not currently open source. I plan on talking to them and saying, hey, like a lot of people would really, really like that, and see if we can get it actually in JupyterLab. But it even if they don't release their version of it, I think that is something that we're going to implement, because
Awesome.
a lot of users would find it very, very helpful.
Before I forget, you had mentioned Mozilla's experience with rules around collecting user data. If we can be helpful, please just reach out. I'd be happy to arrange a meeting with people on our data policy team.
Oh, fantastic. And then are you, Darren, you had something?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, so we're not talking about a generic instrumentation library that we could plug in, since notebooks are a very specific format. I'm not familiar with those tools very much. Are there libraries out there that are customizable enough to do this with, or would we have to build our own instrumentation?
The short answer is I don't know, but I'm sure the answer is yes on both sides. At the simplest level, you're just collecting strings, and the string could be here are a list of cell types. Markdown cell, code cell, code cell, code cell, code cell. You bundle that up into a string and you send it into a database, right? And that's just a row. So it would be you can get as engineer architect as you want to. So Mozilla's infrastructure is this enormous beast with hundreds of thousands of lines of code, a mix of off-the-shelf stuff and pure custom and halfway in between. So it's really about figuring out what is the right tool. For example, in Brian's example, where the idea is that you have a local installation, that's a different kind of approach versus a tool that is designed for the Jupyter project to collect information from beta users. Two completely different needs, and you would evolve the project in different ways. That answer your question?
Yeah, to some extent. I guess I'm just trying to figure out, I guess it doesn't matter too much, because ultimately it'll probably just be some plugin that does the work, irrespective of whether that plugin is implemented using an off-the-shelf library or if we have to write it ourselves. But I don't really know what the state of the industry is with those off-the-shelf tools, because all the tools I've ever worked on have not had that level of introspection on what users are doing in an automated way. So I don't really know what's out there, and I was curious if you did, but
yeah, I don't.
Okay, cool.
I will be sharing with as soon as I can my own effort to statically analyze notebooks, and that may or may not give you ideas about what would be useful and how hard it would be to implement.
Cool.
Yeah, I think the simplest way for us to do this would be to build something very lightweight and custom. Part of it is that I think we have a couple programmatic API places in JupyterLab that we could hook into and very easily record most of the data we wanted, and then just post messages to a REST API that we run somewhere that just grabs that and puts it in some sort of database. I think it would be fairly simple to do that. So one other question, Sam. So are your users using Spark through PySpark or through the Spark Magic?
PySpark, and then quite a few jump into R, and quite a few jump into Scala.
Okay,
but have you looked at PySpark as our default?
Okay. Have you
I'm sorry, go ahead.
evaluated the Spark? Have you evaluated the Spark Magic yet?
I have not.
Are you familiar with this project or?
Not off the top of my head.
Yeah.
So
So
I will
I
look
can.
that up.
Yeah. So what this is a magic function for Python kernel that uses the REST API for Spark, Livy. And it allows you to, here, I'm going to do two things.
I'm looking at the project right now. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, okay, yep. And I'll also post it in the HackPad here for others. So this is the primary people developing this are collaborators of ours at Microsoft, but they also have other people at a number of other companies working with them on this. And it basically allows you to call out to Spark from any Python kernel. And it so it separates the deployment of Spark from the deployment of Jupyter.
Nice.
And so you basically can enter a REST endpoint in the Spark Magic, and it will call out to that Spark cluster. The thing that's nice about that is that from a single notebook, you can call out to PySpark, SparkR, or Scala, and actually the SQL interfaces, Spark SQL as well. And so it's a very sort of unified way of calling out to Spark from a Python-based notebook. And it is nice because it does address one thing you're talking about, is that there's a very clean way of understanding when you're running code in the Jupyter kernel versus when you're running code against Spark, because there's actually a magic function. So our syntax for that is double % something, so double % Spark, or double, and so there's at least some sort of visible artifact for the user saying, okay, now I'm running something. Now, other things that you're talking about, like being able to monitor their remote Spark jobs, understand, did it crash? Did I get disconnected? What if I need to cancel this? Those are things that they're thinking a lot about right now. And different parts of Jupyter are sort of thinking about making it easier to have progress bars in the notebook.
We've actually solved that one. It's just that it's wedged in. And so the question I'm interested in is, to your point, different parts of Jupyter thinking about it. What are the broader lessons we can draw as a user experience? And certainly something like Spark Magic could be very helpful for implementing it. But I want a dialogue between the human experience and kind of the tool shortcuts, because we put some of that Spark integration in, and it was half wonderful and half useless into our own custom notebooks.
Yeah. So yeah, we just had a pull request. I'm looking here in the notebook repo that would enable output in the notebook to receive updates. And the main goal there was to make things like progress bars much easier. And I'm looking here. Let me see. Let's find. Hunting to see if I can find that. There we go. I'll paste this PR into both the chat here and also on the HackPad for folks. And so this was merged to master, and has the links there. And so this is directly coming out of other people's experience in supporting Spark in Jupyter. So that may be another point that's helpful.
I will mention, if you want someone who wants a notebook extension that directly hooks up the Spark ongoing output to an existing notebook, we did write and open source that one. And I don't think we publicized it much, but give me a second.
Hey guys, I have another call at 10 o'clock. We're still recording, so I'm wondering what the best way is to proceed if we hit up against the hour.
I think we can wrap up the discussion here.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, you guys can keep talking, but you might say goodbye to the internet if that's okay with you, Sam.
Yes, absolutely.
And also,
thank you so much for letting me take all of this time on your project. I really appreciate it.
Oh, you guys can keep going. I'm just going to stop the recording. Bye, internet.